So we have started recording.
Okay, I want to introduce folks before we get started. Just so our speaker knows who is here and everybody else we have record of who is here. I'm Carolyn Haynes with Forestry and Natural Resource Commission.
I'm Phil Klinkelhofer, Forestry Natural Resources Commission.
Sarah Barlick, Park and Recreation Commission.
Trudy Kuba, Parks and Recreation as well.
And Jill and David, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'm Jill Barker with Parks and Rec Commission.
I'm David Howell with Forestry and Natural Resources Commission, and that'll be probably the last thing I say tonight.
No, that's not like. Do you all want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
I'm Jennifer Sauls in the Natural Resource Unit Specialist.
And Alonso Obagadas, Natural Resources Manager and Liaison for this.
And Ryan?
Sure. Ryan Delaney, Principal Planner with Parks Development and Project Manager for the FNRP.
Okay, great. And I will introduce Susan after we have our public comments. But okay, so Mary, if you want to go ahead, thank you for being here. You have 3 minutes.
Alonso, can I share my screen?
I don't know if you can. Sometimes you should. If you can, it's right above next to the leave button. And there's a share button with an up pointing thing. You just touch that and you should be able to share it. But I know that not everyone's computer is set up the same way. With Androids, it works a lot differently, I think. Were you able to share?
It's telling me we need your permission. Go to security and privacy. Let's skip it. let's skip it. It may not be worth it. Okay.
You can send us your slides, Mary.
Pardon me?
I said you can send us your slides, and we'd be happy to share them with the group.
It's just one slide, so it's not a big deal.
Okay.
Okay. Ready?
Yep.
Thank you for having me. I want to start out talking about a little bit of history. In March 2021, the Arlington County Civic Federation requested an updated tree canopy report. In March 2022, the Forestry and Natural Resources Commission identified a survey and an inventory as top priorities for that year. In their September comments of that year, on the first draft of the Forestry and Natural Resources Plan, the Forestry Commission called the existing 2017 tree canopy report, quote, not scientifically defensible, unquote. While forestry experts call this data an essential first step for planning, the county has instead deferred it until after the plan has been completed, probably not available until early 2024. In response, private citizens have taken it upon themselves to fund a new tree canopy land cover study using 2021 data. And it comes from satellite data as well as LiDAR data and was conducted by a nationally recognized expert firm. The result is a much more detailed picture of the resource base that indicates a significant loss of tree canopy and an increase in impermeable surfaces. Primary results were able to distinguish true tree canopy from other vegetation and grass. This shows that the current tree canopy is about 7% lower than the county's estimates. Why hasn't Arlington kept pace with Alexandria, Fairfax, and the town of Vienna? Vienna spent $17,000 last fall for a new tree canopy study and has earmarked $85,000 for a full public tree inventory, which Arlington still lacks. Instead, the county has committed $400,000 just on consultants to write this plan. Why is the new information so valuable now? Well, this group understands that our natural resources, taken collectively, offer a major public service benefit in the areas of climate change, health and well-being, flood mitigation, and much, much more. This group must lean in to optimize this plan. I recommend the following actions. 1, pause the preparation of the plan until new data can be analyzed and integrated into it. 2, use the data to provide important information about our resource base and set measurable goals in the plan. 3, review the justification for spending an additional $150,000 for another study, given the improved 2021 data that's now available, and redirect these funds to use for a full tree inventory. I know this is asking a lot and compressing a lot into a short time, but I will send along a picture of one of the maps that's now available, and there are many more maps that'll be available shortly for analysis.
Great, thank you. That was exactly 3 minutes. Thanks, Mary. Appreciate your sharing that with us, and we'd be happy to send that around. Okay, next I want to introduce Susan Bell, who was with the county for 28 years, and the last however many as director of community planning, housing, and development. And Susan was there when they did the last lot coverage issue or adjustment. And so anyway, she, as we were talking on the phone today, she may have PTSD after all of that stuff going through that, because it was fraught always when you have an issue like this. But I had noted that this is a discussion point that we've had in the Forestry and Natural Resource Plan, and we had not had any background on it. So I thought it would be great to have Susan here since she was there on the front line. So anyway, really, really, really appreciate you being here and giving us some background on this. And so however you want to proceed, and I'm sure we'll have some questions along the way.
Yeah.
But
Feel free to ask questions as I go, because I have kind of 3 segments of information I want to share. And if at any time it becomes unclear or I, slip into jargon, stop me. As Carolyn said, I was with the county for a very long time. 10 of those years, I was actually the zoning administrator for the county. So I had a very up close view of development in the county and also how development was evolving. But one of the things that we spent a lot of time with is in administration of the code. It's not just the drafting of new ordinances to, frustrate people in what they want to do with their property. The day-to-day administration of the code is challenging, in part because people want to do things the code won't allow, and you can only enforce the ordinance you have, not the one you wish you had. And there are frequently more lawyers in the room than there are staff to deal with an issue. But I just want to give you an idea of how just lot coverage evolved. When Arlington developed its first ordinance in 1938, it was 13 pages long and coverage was not mentioned. There were 2 single-family residential zoning districts, 13 pages, 2 districts. By 1942, it was about 50 pages long, and the lot coverage term was not introduced in a definition, but as a regulation, and it was restricted to 30% on any single family lot, of which the predominant development pattern was really around what we think of as the metro corridor neighborhoods, the oldest neighborhoods in the county. 30%, and it basically was the house, the detached garage, because that's mostly what they built, and the driveway, which was frequently strips in those days. There weren't accessory buildings, there weren't multiple sheds. It was pretty much that. The emphasis on coverage and the restrictions about how buildings related to each other on lots was mainly to protect light and air and to allow for the swales that probably none of you here remember in the backyards to provide drainage, because we didn't have stormwater management in those days. The water flowed between the lots, largely at the rear property line. A lot of neighborhoods still don't have storm sewers. By 1950, the county adopted an entire new zoning ordinance. So they went from 2 residential districts in the 40s to pretty much the single family names we have today. And in 1950 adopted yet another whole new ordinance, modified coverage to 30% in R5 and R6, the 2 smallest single family lot zones, 5,000 and 6,000 square foot respectively, and 25% in the others. So in R20, up by Gulf Branch or up by Country Club, the R10, R8, 25% coverage, bigger lot, yes, a bigger house, but they just didn't feel like you needed as much land area covered. Of course, in some of the larger zones, you have more lots that exceed the minimum, whereas in the R5 and R6 zones, you tend to have lots of lots that are substandard, but were platted prior to the adoption of zoning. So somewhere between 1950 and 1965, I could not find it. And I don't have every zoning ordinance ever created still. Many of them, but not all of them. Lot coverage went to 56%. So that was a big jump in 15 years.
that was from 1950 to 1965.
Somewhere, the 65 ordinance, of which there were many amendments between 50 and 65, somewhere in there, it went to 56% in all single family zones. So that doubled the amount of coverage you could have in R8, R10, are 20, the big properties. And considerably increased it in the smaller lots as well. Now, we could argue all day long about what the antecedents were that led to that. I just don't have any information. And my recollection of the legislative files on these changes is that they're pretty thin on the background. You might get lucky once in a while to find a memo, but I don't have access to that today. So from 1965 to 2005, it was 56%.
Oh, so it didn't change at all.
Didn't change at all.
Wow.
Conservation.
So you can imagine how many houses were built, largely in the zones away from the transit corridors.
Right.
That 56% was what they knew and what they understood. So fast forward to between 65 and the 80s. If you'll recall, for those of you who were here then, you know, the 80s were a time of great change in Arlington. I-66, metro-related development. There was just a lot happening. The Pentagon City Mall was built in the mid-80s. Arlington was becoming a fairly enviable location for people to live. It wasn't what we used to call country post office that it had been, very low key and, you know, sort of mid-level federal worker housing. The economy was changing and the demands for development were changing as well. So in the 80s, I went to zoning in 1988. I became zoning administrator in 88. And we almost joked about it, but the most frequent addition that people wanted to do to their homes was blow out the back of the house, put on the kitchen great room, master bedroom suite above, and a big deck. That was the classic. And the challenge on that wasn't lot coverage, because virtually no houses exceeded lot coverage. 56% was almost unattainable, okay, if you were going to meet your setbacks. Nobody got variances for lot coverage unless their house was being used legally or otherwise for too many people. You know, it was just almost impossible, because part of the coverage definition, both in the ordinance and practice, was it's everything that the footprint of the house, a garage if it's detached, and the driveway. But the wording actually is anything that is used for parking or maneuvering. So there were places in Aurora Highlands where they had paved the entire backyard. It's a patio. And then you go there and it was covered in cars. And it's, you know, yeah, it might be a patio some days, but if the cars are there every night and all weekend, et cetera, we considered it coverage. And so those were the kinds of situations where we had people bumping up against 56%. It wasn't people trying to fill their lot with structures, you know, residences. What we were also seeing in those additions was a considerable increase in the size of the average house, right?
Yeah.
You know, you're basically doubling the size of the house.
It's the 80s.
And the 80s,
Yeah.
right?
I wasn't alive.
It's not your fault, is that what you're saying, Shirley?
Yeah.
There were
Boomers ruined it for
There
us.
were rules around, you know, altering non-conforming structures. So if a house existed and the rules changed such that the house was now too close to a lot line or the street, it was considered a conforming use, non-conforming structure. And you were restricted in your addition to 50% or less. Okay, so you could only grow your house so much. And that increase, that new addition had to conform to the ordinance, even if the house didn't. So in my neighborhood, there are a number of houses that are still 3 feet off the property line that blew out the back and went as far back as they could and still conform to the ordinance. So, you know, you have a lot of Franken houses that from the street look great, maybe. But, you know, when you go to the side, there's just a lot more house there. But even then, they didn't approach 56%. Okay, so the average size is going up. And, you know, this is the period when Arlington's affluence as a community was really growing. And the kinds of people that were moving here were people who were earning, not just in the federal sector, but then maybe in the tech sector or the communications sector. And they were able to have a bedroom for every kid and increase the number of bathrooms so that everybody wasn't queued for the same bathroom in the morning And that triggered a lot of expansion at the plant because they had to increase the water line because the water pressure goes down if you have too many bathrooms. So it ripples through the whole system. So by the time some of the houses that we thought of as monster houses were being built, the Pershing Drive house was one that affected our neighborhood. There was one on Sycamore Street where a lot of people were very exercised by, that. Now it kind of is about the same size as everything around
Everything
it.
else is caught up.
But,
yeah.
There were some of these sort of exemplars of monster houses or suburban construction that people were very unhappy about. And they didn't like the appearance of a Cape Cod or a split foyer, Center Hall Colonial bungalow type house, any of those types of houses that were, 1 to 2 stories. And then you had a house that was maximum height right next to it. People were really unhappy about it.
So when do you start to see those complaints trickle in, like on the timeline?
In the 80s.
In the 80s
In the
themselves?
80s,
Okay.
yeah. Most
So
of the
it's
construction
still-
up to that point was fairly modest.
And even with the lot size, like
Even
the
with, even
Yeah.
with,
50%.
even with people wanting, to do the big addition out the back. But one of the things we started to see was people wanting to maximize the use of the basement. And there were building code changes that came into being. You have a minimum height for the basement. Well, that minimum height also requires a window well if there's going to be a bedroom down there. People wanted to have the extra bedroom down there. So now that's starting to drive the geometry of the basement because the window well can't be but 3 feet above the floor. You got to be able to get up. That means all the houses are half basement out of the ground, steps to the front. Suddenly the house is pushing up against the height limit. So we did get variances for height. Sometimes it was a builder error. Sometimes it was, a genuine proposal. But height was calculated from the curb line. It's hard to even make it sound sensible at this point, but we used the curb elevation and it was to the midpoint of the main roof, 35 feet. So developers and architects got very clever about designing roof pitches such that they could get a lot of space under roof and they didn't have to slope walls.
So that's why you get some really weird
Some very
architecture.
Very, sort of erect looking
Right.
houses, whereas we would have in our older houses, mine's almost 100 years old, you have sloped walls
Yeah.
in pretty much every room upstairs. Doesn't happen in these houses. There are, 6 or 7 or 10 stairs to the front door. The garage may be partially submerged. The basement is half out of the ground. The walls are straight all the way up. And the roof pitch may be, multiple pitches, lots of dormers. We had to come up with interpretations for how big a dormer could be before it became a floor. Because people would run a dormer the entire length of a wall and then try to tell you that, no, it's not, it's a dormer. Well, no, that's a new wall, that's a new roof. And so we were dealing with all these things, and the BCA caseload for adjustments to building height, street setback, occasionally to side yard or aggregate side yard, which was the aggregate was different. 8 was your minimum, and then there was another number. And sometimes people couldn't make both sets of numbers work. But the distance between the main building and the detached garage or the shed became an issue. In some cases, people couldn't make the 10 feet. It was supposed to be a 10-foot swath. The BZA was happy to grant 10-foot point to point.
So BCA
Board of Zoning Appeals, appointed by the circuit court for 4-year terms. Amazing caseload, 300 cases.
It sounds like the Wild West of coming up with rules. You know what I mean?
Well,
you gotta break them.
we were still operating, with the same set of rules we'd had since the 50s for the most part, and we thought they were pretty sound. But there is a statute in the Code of Virginia that says if your Board of Zoning Appeals is routinely granting variances for particular provisions, you need to take a look at the provision.
That's good.
Okay, so we did do a few things kind of around the edges. See, I left zoning in 98. And we did a few things to deal with pipe stem lots and split lots and a couple of other things. But then it became clear that with the pushback on infill, we were really going to have to take a more comprehensive look. So there was sort of the top 10 items. And we saved coverage for last for obvious reasons. But, you know, among the things we amended was, where do you calculate building height from? We moved it from the curb to the front of the building because we had so many complaints about builders mounding up dirt to change where the height calculation was made.
Oh my God, scam.
Okay, and you know, boy, is that hard. It's hard to tell. I mean, I
I know,
have
right?
seen
Come up, you see a
surveys
mound
that
of
look-
dirt. Oh, is that the curb? Like, what?
surveys that look exactly the same have different numbers on them. You know,
Yeah.
that's not to say that they're, you know, Shylocks or anything like that, but that the, you know, some of this is more art than science. Okay, so we did building height, we did aggregate side yard, we did the distance between main and accessory building, we did a variety of things, and finally we had to take on coverage. And so we started coverage, say around 2002, I think. I wasn't doing it day to day at that point. I was director of the department at that point and wasn't in the weeds of it, fortunately. But the thing that I think that's important to note is that the infill actually had continued, right? So even with these changes that are being made incrementally, people are relatively okay with them. We're not getting a lot of outcry about any of them.
Really? Even with these like sweeping changes, that wasn't like a whole bunch of.
Well, they really were incremental, you know, because frankly, most lots in Arlington are relatively flat.
Mhm.
And we would get variance requests on steeply sloping lots where the difference between the curb and where they could build the top of the thing, they could build a doghouse. You know, they just couldn't put much of a house there. And the BCA always granted those.
Yeah.
So we decided, let's mitigate the issue of topo, and we'll create a different, you know, thing that's relevant to the actual house that's being built, the addition that's being built.
It sounds to me like that was an excellent time to make those changes then, before folks were moving in who would be opinionated about things like that.
I mean, I'm not going to say that we had no attention paid to it, because we, you know, we made the rounds with the neighborhood conservation folks,
Right.
with the various civic associations that were most concerned. We went to the historic fair, we went to all the relevant commissions, but it's pretty technical. And most people, you know, if they stood on the street, couldn't tell you whether a house was 35 feet or 30 feet, but they know what they like. And so trying to figure, you know, kind of work through that and figure out how we could get to something that people could agree was a reasonable standard for the go forward was hard. You know, it was really important.
Did you do all of those then kind of as a package, or did you do them incrementally? Just
We
kept
did
taking
them
on?
over a period of years.
Okay, so you take on a topic.
A topic. By the time we were doing coverage, we were embroiled in affordable housing. And we'd had 5 lawsuits filed. We were
Because it was
working with a working
2002,
group.
that's what you're saying now?
Well, it was actually 2005 is when we had all
The
the
real
affordable
conversation,
housing working group going. But 2002 or 3 was about when we began the coverage work. But we had better tools than we'd had before. You know, everything wasn't a paper file. We had more up-to-date flyovers of the county. We had GIS mapping. So we actually could figure stuff out, you know, what is actually happening on the ground. And so we had different proposals that came in, but unlike, you know, the early discussions back in the day about light and air and preserving green space and corridors for birds and things like that, some of the issues that came up in those discussions were, oh my God, this is a largely built up community. You can't make all these houses non-conforming by virtue of changing the code. So in other words, if it was consistent with the code when it was built, whether it was, you know, 1978, 1928, or 1998, and you changed the rules, you could make that house non-conforming. And from a staff standpoint, a non-conforming status was fairly benign. We really didn't see that as being a huge issue, but there were instances of people who couldn't get financing for things. They'd had a conversation with their banker or their mortgage banker, and they were told, oh, I don't know, we would want to, that kind of hesitancy. So that left a lot of people really antsy about it. And just to give you an idea, in 2005, Arlington had 96,000 housing units, all types, 96,131. 27,678 were single family houses. Okay, so not quite a little more than a quarter of all the housing in the county was single family. That was only an increase of 1,100 since 1983. Net new houses.
1,100, not 11,000.
1,100.
That's a while.
Okay, 1983 to 2005. In 2022, the most recent county profile says there's 120,200 housing units in Arlington. 27,500 are single-family detached houses, and all of these numbers are the 20-somethings are detached. That means we have had a net increase since 2005 of 1,323 houses. So most of the single-family stuff you're seeing is tear downs.
Yeah.
Tear downs and rebuilds.
Yep.
Okay, so I mentioned that there were a lot of moving parts when we were doing what became the 2005 amendment. There was a big groundswell to not make a substantial portion of that number of houses non-conforming. There was big, and part of the issue with non-conforming not only was the financing, but we had rules about what you could do to non-conforming properties. And if your house was flattened by a tree, could you build it back?
Mhm.
And the rules at the time said, if your house is flattened and it exceeds 75% of the value of the house, no.
So you'd have to build
You'd have
back
to
under
build
the
it
new
back,
rules.
and you would have to comply with the current rules, whatever rules are in effect. And people were very exercised about that. The value of the location had only grown, by 2005. The Orange Crush was in the paper all the time. People liked the idea of living close in. And so we were getting a lot of these tear downs and people coming in wanting to build what, to many people's eyes would be very suburban style construction, or, very large. The average size of houses went up, and I don't have access to those numbers. But nationally, the average size of a house went up until the crash of 2007, flattened for a few years, and went back up again after COVID or during COVID. So among the issues, we had the non-conforming one. We had the pressure on the fact that it's a built-up community. How many more houses can we possibly fit here? A lot of the big estates had been sold and subdivided by then. We had continuing building code requirements and pressure from things like accessory dwellings and people's desires to have family suites. And now, of course, all of that has moved way beyond the rules that were then in place. You had evolving consumer expectations for housing. I talked about the no sloping walls, the single purpose room. Everybody needs a home office now. They still wanted a home gym then. Things that, if you live in a bungalow like I do, you go, yeah, that's the butler pantry and the mudroom and the whatever. But people wanted different things, and they were willing to pay for the location. And frankly, the housing stock in Arlington was old. If you were to look at the census numbers, and I didn't have a chance to pull them, the average age of the housing stock in the county was 50 years or more by 2005. So, the useful life of the structure, had it not been maintained or well maintained, was approaching the point where for some people it was obsolete. And that for them, the cost of renovation and the brain damage associated with it was too much. And frankly, we all know that renovation per square foot cost is higher than new construction. So for a lot of people, there's no math to do. They just buy it, tear it down, and build a new one. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that there were, these competing pressures were somewhat of a old Arlington, new Arlington kind of thing. There were certain neighborhoods that were more accepting of the changes than others. But the notion of sort of do no harm was very front and center to this existing housing stock of 27,000 houses. They didn't want people to suddenly be unable to do it. So in the final adopted ordinance language, we fixed some of the provisions around non-conforming buildings and placement. We went to a sliding scale based on lot size because we felt that was more equitable. We put a cap on the size of the building because we felt that even, that setbacks and side yards and all were not enough of a guardrail. We felt we needed to have, a cap. Otherwise, it would just overwhelm the lot. But, in all honesty, the focus was very, very much on physical plant. We weren't looking at the natural environment at all. We weren't even really looking at runoff. The Ches Bay ordinances were being amended and the planters and all of those things were coming in subsequent to this amendment. But our focus was strictly on, how big should the building be? How do we treat unusual lots, odd shaped lots, lots with topo, et cetera. And so we took a proposal to the board in probably January of 2005. They advertised it in February, gave us marching orders to go back and look at actual construction. We had somebody go back and pull the last 200 houses and they were able to analyze them and none of them approached 56%. So we felt very comfortable dropping below 56%, but we didn't feel comfortable having a one size fits all.
So with the
regulation.
sliding scale, did that reduce the number of non-compliant structures ultimately? And that reduced the fear surrounding it?
I think the thing that took away, I won't say took away the fear, but maybe mitigated some of it was adjusting the non-conforming building rules.
Providing them the sliding
Yes, well, giving them, in the non-conforming provisions, instead of having that 50% limit, additions were allowed as long as they conformed. So there wasn't a 50% restriction anymore.
So as long as they conform to the setbacks and height for
right.
them.
Right. So because that 50% was, well, let's see. They did leave, let's see.
It's just continuing interest in being a conforming property, I guess.
I think the board said this earlier. My recollection was that there was the language when taken together allowed you to do more than just this 50% rule did. They also clarified there was a conflict between our local ordinance and the Code of Virginia on how long you had if you had a calamity to your structure. And of course, we did have a number of houses that were severely damaged after Isabel. All the trees came down, and there were houses that went well past a year before they could go to construction because of fighting with insurance companies and contractors. And our rules had been a year. We switched to 2 because, in fact, that's what the state code said. But they clarified it. It wasn't restricted to value because that 75% figure for an older house just wasn't helpful if you were trying to get to a new house or a new portion of a house. But again, the sliding scale was intended to reflect on the fact that, the 5,000 square foot single family lot that some of the oldest neighborhoods have is probably smaller than any other community in Northern Virginia. So is our R6 with its 6,000 square foot lot. The minimums in most other communities, Falls Church and other places, tend to be closer to 10 or 8. Old Town Alexandria, of course, is an exception, but it's an exception because it's completely historic as well. So, the goals of this were really to do as little harm as possible, to allow people to invest in their properties. As I think there's a desire that the housing stock be healthy, and that it be safe. I think there was a recognition that we needed to allow some growth in the single family stock. But again, it's been modest.
Very modest. Yeah.
You know, what is it, 1,100 homes in almost over 20 years, and then a smaller number. But the continued tear down phenomenon, I think, is also, you know, starting to rankle people quite a bit.
So a lot, that 1,100, is that a result of like double lots and doing two houses where there was one?
It's double lots, and there's a provision that is, you know, kind of hard to find, but there is a provision that says if you had a platted lot and the lot was in the same ownership at the time when that section was adopted, you could break those lots apart and they would each stand on their own to be eligible for development with a house. So for example, there is a series of wedge-shaped lots in Lyon Park. There had been one house that had been held in the same ownership. That house was knocked down in a nanosecond after it was sold. And there are now two very modern houses that were built that follow the exact setback and yard things. I mean, it's almost perfect, but it's a pie-shaped lot. So you can imagine how weird the back of the house is actually quite a bit narrower than the front. And so you can free up those lots. And there are some neighborhoods where the house is on one lot and maybe there was an accessory building on the other lot. That accessory building is not required. You create a driveway on the original lot. That other one is free. It's unencumbered. Now, if you have a house that's built over the line, you know, so you have your house and it's built over the line of that other lot. Now that other lot is encumbered. You have to cut the house off and make it comply in order to free up that lot, and people do it.
Which is what a lot of us, I know there's a couple streets in Westover where they were all double lots and they were all torn down and put two houses there.
I have a friend who lives in one of those like lima bean shaped lots now. But you know, the setback is insane. Do they just look crazy in some of these houses?
Yeah.
And she paid a fortune. Yeah.
Well, we spent 3 years trying to come up with a way to define minimum average lot width in a way that surveyors wouldn't give us lot lines that went like this, because it was the midpoint of the lot. And then we created 5 points to try and geometrically smooth it out. They found ways. It's kind of amazing, you know, it's like a red flag. But I think, you know, at the time that we did this was sort of the end of a multi-part cycle. We felt like the package together would give us reasonable infill regulations for the next 10 years, 15 years maybe, because it's a big thing to take this on, you know, even using GIS to calculate actual coverages of lots and flyovers and things like that. It's a big project. So it's not surprising to me that they've gone this long without looking at coverage again. One of the outcomes, and I believe it's on the county website, the zoning administrator then put together a definition, not only a definition, but a list of what counts as coverage. Excuse me, because there are so many things that happen on a lot that aren't building and aren't parking. And so how is a swimming pool treated? Okay, it's got an apron. If it's in the ground, is that covered? Okay, that was one. Play structures. You know, people put them up for their kids and then they become sheds, but they're there. They are sitting on the ground. What was one of the other ones? Oh, people do, in some cases, people put decks at 8 inches. It's like a patio. But sometimes decks come off the second level. And it's not really on the ground, just the posts are on the ground. And so we really needed sort of a guidebook as to how things were going to be calculated. And so the administrator at the time put together a list, a determination which was not challenged in court. And so
So
that
it was not.
stands. It was not.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm surprised the state tells us everything else to do. I'm surprised the state didn't tell us this counts and that doesn't.
Yeah, the state did not, the state actually doesn't even talk about coverage. It just talks about the permission to have zoning regulations. And it kind of leaves it up to you, meaning the local jurisdiction to
Right.
define what's acceptable for them in the legislative process. So anyway, we have a very detailed list, and because so many things got added, there's now a how to calculate lot coverage worksheet
Your own tax.
that you
form.
have to submit with your building permit. Yeah, and there's a different one for every zone because there's a different set of restrictions. So we're gonna replace our garage and I have to do this. I feel like I'm being punished, but anyway.
Can I'm gonna ask you because you don't have to answer it, but in your opinion, given that this hasn't been looked at in such a long time, where do you think, I'm gonna put the blame on developers, are picking the biggest holes?
We don't regulate tree preservation on private property. I think that's a huge hole.
Okay.
And I would say that if I wasn't here, I would say that in public.
Yeah, I had told it that might be an interesting.
Okay.
story.
I know,
do.
and it's one that would have wild support.
Well, I'm not sure. I think it would be amongst the people
Who would be yell the loudest?
who get, well,
Sometimes,
sometimes.
until you get the other side.
Yes,
Yeah.
you know, I spent a lot of years listening to people yell about different things, and it's very different when it's their lot. Because, people are more than willing to tell you what to do with your property, but they don't want anybody to tell them what to do. And I mean, it's just human nature. So but I do think that is something, you know, we've lost a lot of white oaks in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
And other people, I can't borrow someone else's canopy to make my yard not be in the sun all the time. So I think that's one. I think pretty much any set of rules that you come up with, there will be clever people who will work to find a way around them. But I think we have to establish what our values are with respect to infill development. As a community, do we want it? Do we want it to look a particular way, or do we not care? You know, one of the big debates in '05 was about sort of bonus coverage for detached garages and front porches. Those were considered community goods. People didn't like the house attached to a garage appearance that some new construction had, you know, this sort of the double garage doors, and then the house is set back and it kind of looks like the garage is in charge. And a lot of people didn't, you know, were offended by that style.
But that really that value shaped
Exactly.
the policy back then.
Right.
Now,
And
who cares?
Well, now we, because it's been an issue with trees, because when you put your garage in the back, typically that's
You're
where your
abating,
trees are.
yeah.
So you
well,
have
and there's
no
also
trees.
runoff issues that have to be addressed because again, that swale that got built with fences and sheds is pretty much full now, and garages. You know, we moved garages away from
Everybody parks
property
in the
lines.
street 'cause we don't want to drive all the way.
Right. Well, we moved
Creating a new
garages away
problem.
from property lines so that they could actually be maintained on the person's property. They used to be allowed to be 1 foot from the side and the rear lot line. I mean, you can't even get a ladder up there to clean the gutters if you happen to have gutters on your garage. So we tried to do some things that would make that detached garage less of a burden for the neighbors who kind of shoved it toward them. But at the same time, we modified the point-to-point you know, the swath of 10 feet between that garage and the house went from a swath of 10 to a typically granted 10. Now it's 8 feet by right, point to point. So that swath is gone. It probably has a deck in it. May have a screen porch at this point. You know, what was important has changed. And, you know, I do not want to talk about missing middle, but I think that has generated a lot of conversation about what people want. And the things that keep coming up have to do with trees, and the size of existing houses is not talked about except in terms of what might be built under missing middle. So I feel like you should attack the issues that bother you.
Rather than with it. So Jill, I want to make sure that, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Oh, thanks. I just raised it. Thank you so much for this great presentation. I just, I feel like I should know this, but something like 25% of the housing stock is single family. But what about the land distribution? So I feel like I should know this, but is the single family land more, I'm assuming it's way more of a percentage than
Yeah,
the 25%.
I can speak to it in terms of the tax base.
Okay,
50% of the taxes in the county are generated by the transit corridors and 50% by the single family neighborhoods. And it shifts a few percent either way each year. But significantly more land area is in single family housing. I just don't know the number.
I think it's around 80%, Jill. But one of the early missing middle concept presentations, there's a map that has the actual numbers. You can see kind of visually how the single family zoning areas compare to commercial and mixed use.
It's pretty dramatic.
Oh yeah. It's really striking. It's mostly yellow.
Pale yellow is
Yeah.
predominant.
wait, what's yellow? I mean, is it,
Single family.
but I mean, and
The
so
lowest
that's a
single
large
family
percentage of the
is
land.
Density development.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's somewhere like
50 to
70%
80%.
of the land is single family zone.
Okay.
Other
mean,
questions?
Well, I was just wondering, can I follow up a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we're gonna have these new stormwater rules. I guess the county's gonna vote on them in April, and they're being developed now. And so that's more of an incentive situation instead of a zoning. It's kind of getting at it with the carrot, I guess, instead of the stick. But do you have any view? Maybe I shouldn't ask you this, but do you think that'll have any effect on lot coverage and tree retention and actually
Really not
stormwater?
in a position to answer that. I haven't
Yeah.
studied those regulations, to be honest.
Well, they haven't been published, they haven't been made public yet, but the concept is to, require more. In other words, you get a lower utility tax. Sorry, we're going away from a tax and we're going to a fee. So your fee will be lower if you do certain things to address stormwater on your property.
I think that will probably make housing in Arlington more valuable then, because the location only gets better.
Yeah, we're not moving. We're not
Right.
changing. We're here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, thanks. I appreciate it.
I have a question. When you say infill development, what are you referring to with that
Oh,
phrase?
that's a fair question. I think of infill as development that is replacing what was there or where there was no development before.
Okay.
So it could be that big lot that gets split, or it could be a tear down to me.
Okay.
It's change.
Yeah.
In character. I don't consider the transit corridors the site plan development infill. That's just wholesale redevelopment.
Okay.
Arlington always wanted to leverage the transit investment in redevelopment.
Even if it's rezoning of, there's a parcel in the courthouse neighborhood, Courthouse West. It's just an empty lot right now, and it has been for years. It is getting regloved, so it will eventually have buildings on it, but you wouldn't call that infill?
Yeah, I guess technically that it's development where there'll be a major change, but I just see what happened. It's my planning background, but I see what happens within the sort of metro station area, that quarter mile, as being very different than what is happening out in the neighborhoods and along the commercial streets.
And as a generalization, I think we see that pretty clearly. I think there's an element here of historic preservation that we're not bringing up, and how that can also impact the life cycle of a home, and the ability for it to be infilled
Right.
versus just like prepared.
Sure.
Did that have any impact on this timeline?
Well, that's actually an interesting question. The county has a historic preservation provision that's part of the zoning ordinance. And within it, there is something called a neighborhood historic district. Neighborhoods could propose that their houses be included in a historic district. And we have two right now, Maywood and Buckingham. And I believe it's the entirety of Buckingham condos, co-ops. And I can tell you there was litigation about the Buckingham one.
I've lived in one of those for a while. I
And it
didn't know
was
that
very
historic.
difficult, and there were challenges to the Maywood one. Each has a set of design guidelines.
I've seen the houses in Maywood, but I've not ever been in them, obviously.
But it includes trees
Okay.
in both cases.
Okay.
And they each had design guidelines developed that say that trees over a certain caliper can't be cut. And unless, originally it was the HLRB, and then I think they went back and said, if there's been a tree that's broken in a storm, staff can go out and approve it. A couple of other neighborhoods, including Lion Park, considered that. For a variety of reasons, they were pretty intact at that time. I forget what the other one was. The votes in the neighborhoods were completely opposed.
I can see that.
Parts of Clarendon, we actually tried to put parts of Clarendon, the old commercial, in, and property owners resisted. So that has not, if you have a willing community, it's great. But it has not caught on.
Is there like a NVCT for historic preservation? Is there like
There's
a
a
group
National
that
Historic
goes out
Trust.
there? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's national organizations and I'm probably local organizations.
Yeah, with the Department of Interior, you can have a neighborhood put on the National Register and buildings put on the National Register, and lots of Arlington neighborhoods have been put on the register, and that gives property owners access to tax credits. You have to do a lot of work to earn the tax credit, and you can be rejected, and it can take you several turns of the wheel to get approval. But it's a fairly sizable tax credit if you can get approved. For a while, that was a pretty big incentive for people to do work on their homes and preserve their houses. But again, it's an honorific.
Yeah.
And so if you sell your house, the next person who comes along can still demo the house. It's not a, it doesn't get you
Forever.
anything in perpetuity.
And also it strikes me that there's probably less and less eligible homes as time goes on too.
Potentially. I know in the case of our house, the state rejected a project that we wanted to do. We had concrete steps and we took them off and we did replace it with tile on the, told us we had to put concrete steps back.
Really?
And that was kind of our reaction. It was like,
For
really? You
historic
think there was
purposes.
concrete steps in 1926?
There were not.
Of course not. But they were original.
Yeah, right.
And it's, so we were like, okay, fine, whatever.
It's like an antique piece of furniture, you're not supposed to fix it, right?
Right,
You're supposed
right.
to let it
This is not
continue to be an
practical.
antique,
So,
yeah.
I don't mean to, tell stories out of school, but some of these things kind of get in the way of what they're trying to accomplish.
But if we can be valuable here in promoting historic preservation as a way to
Right.
protect trees on a property, then that is a mechanism I did not know about,
Well, it's I don't think you can get tax credits for preserving trees, but in terms of historic preservation tax credits, but I think sensitive design that allows a tree to be preserved, yes. And actually, Carrie Johnson worked on a design manual for Ashton Heights, her neighborhood, so that when they had renovations, they would be sensitive to what happened in the community. And they did tons of work on materials and sources, and it was a great document for that particular neighborhood of brick and some bungalow houses.
Jill, I'd love to see like a picture down the line in Buckingham of a historic tree next to a eco action new tree build, you know?
That's a great idea. I'll have to think of that. I'll have to think of if we can get an example of that.
Those like confluences in these historic neighborhoods, it's pretty remarkable.
I wonder, is the county allowed to, I'm sorry, this is totally just me talking off the top of my head, but brainstorming, is the county allowed to give tax credits for things like tree preservation if it wants to?
I doubt
Don't.
it.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't researched it, but
Okay.
I don't think the county gives tax credits except in very limited circumstances.
Right, the county doesn't give tax credits even for conservation easements.
Right.
But it
Which-
could, but it could.
It could, but
Yeah.
it's one of the only ones in the state that doesn't do that.
Right, so that's why
Right.
I was wondering if it could do that. Could it also give a tax credit for tree preservation? I don't know. Under that same theory.
I don't know. I mean, one of the things, and Carolyn and I talked about this, is maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit,
Go
but
ahead, no.
one of the things, that's always challenging if the county doesn't have the authority, getting the General Assembly to vote something in that isn't, that might be throughout the Commonwealth is challenging. And so one of the options is to try for Arlington specific legislation and put it in the county manager plan section of the Code of Virginia, not in the full-blown, everybody has to deal with it. And so I did look up, and Arlington's affordable housing ordinance, which was adopted ultimately by the General Assembly for us, is in the county manager plan section of chapter 15.2 of the code.
So this was fascinating to me, and some of you may or may not know this, but when Susan and I were talking this afternoon, can you just sort of give a little
Sure.
more background on that?
There's a lot of different forms of government in Virginia. County executive, county manager, council manager. And then what we have is a manager who's supposed to be the chief administrative officer and then an elected board. And that's called the county manager plan of government. And in the section of the state code that deals with government charters and things like that, and then moves on to zoning and subdivision and all, there are regulations around the county manager plan of government. So it's kind of a grab bag of provisions. It's everything from the grievance procedure that staff have to follow to, whether you can require employees to live in the county, et cetera. But the affordable housing ordinance is there. And there are other permissions. And so if you wanted to do something that was pretty much just Arlington, that's where you could put it. And then nobody else in Virginia would have to abide by it unless they were that form of government or switched to that form of government. But they could probably also get it amended to take themselves out of it. Otherwise, you end up modifying provisions that apply pretty much statewide, and you have to craft the legislation so that it's narrowed down so that it might only be, a community that borders on the Potomac River.
That has a Pentagon in it.
And they do have language that's almost like that.
Oh my
Like, it's
God.
the population no more than, no less than in planning district A, in the sunsets, in the, over the commercial area of Roslyn. And it's kind of like that. If you want to put it in the more general provisions, you really have to build coalitions. And that's a multi-year step. That's not a single thing, because, you've probably all heard the jokes about the People's Republic of Arlington when it comes to the General Assembly.
Well, and the vindictive,
The people,
simply because it comes from Arlington.
Right,
Good.
because it comes from Arlington.
Could you talk about the history behind when those plans, when those particular ideas have come up and with communities trying to put a special rule just for themselves? How often does that actually go through? Or is it almost a fool's errand, hoping that?
No, I would never call it a fool's errand. If it's something that you believe needs to be done, You just have to be in it for the long haul sometimes. When we did the affordable housing ordinance, we got the agreement of Citizen Developer Task Force. Barbara Favola went to the General Assembly. She wasn't in the General Assembly at the time.
So she was a
She
county board
testified as a county board member. We worked with neighboring jurisdictions who, because Arlington's site plan process is very different than what everybody else does. Everybody else has a slightly different tack, but we do optional increases in density in consideration for X and Y. And so the work was done. And I think because the legislation was just for Arlington, and because there was a pretty much unanimous support for it within this working group of citizens and developers, I think the General Assembly, who had to vote on it, the committee, and then the ultimate votes, felt like, okay, it's okay. And we had other legislation that came our way that, like I did a civil penalties program for zoning violations because frankly, nobody's going to get a criminal record for zoning violation, or not often, certainly never in my tenure. And so we decided to go for civil penalties with fines. Well, we didn't have the authority to do that. So we went Arlington only for that. Got it. Some board members wanted a lighting ordinance. That went in the Arlington only stuff. So I think it's a lot easier if you're not trying to make it a statewide thing. And I used to know, but I don't remember if there are more than 2 county manager plan communities in the whole of Virginia. I just don't remember, but I know there's one. And so, I'm pretty sure based on my reading of that section, it's probably just Arlington, maybe one other community, but
Reston is similar. They're a board, it's an association of board of directors. There isn't a county manager, it's something else. It's not a county.
Right, because it's in the joint.
Yeah,
Yeah.
similar.
so I think it's feasible. And, it depends on your timing. You might find that there are other communities that would like the same legislation, mostly probably in the urban parts of the state, but you might be able to draft it in a way that it goes in the larger section and works for more than just Arlington.
That again would be building coalition.
Yeah, but it is definitely, and
Possible.
it's probably a multi-session effort. I don't know what they do for these kinds of issues, environmental issues, but I have been to Richmond to lobby on behalf of affordable housing. There's a day when they go. Jay Facette was down there lobbying on environmental stuff the same day. So, there are days when like-minded people kind of convene down there. I guess it's at around crossover, and it's a really great opportunity to begin to build understanding of what you're trying to get to. And it can be, again, it can be a while.
Right,
But
persistent.
There
Yeah.
are other organizations that have similar goals. You can get them to sign on.
Yeah.
But I think the trick is, we have to have the county board all in agreement and pushing for it. We're not going to be able to get anywhere if we have a fractured board, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
necessary first step.
Right.
Yeah, so I think we're shut down right now, so we gotta figure that part out.
So do other questions or other ideas that people have? I know when Susan and I were talking too, obviously our focus and the FNRP is with focus on trees and preserving green space. So it's sort of going back to the original intent of the air and light and green space. And obviously stormwater too is a big deal now too. So, how do we leverage that kind of going through this? But, so any advice on, I understand it isn't supposed to be in the work plan for CPHD for this coming year.
I don't know.
I guess it's waiting on the FNRP first, and then it would go into the work plan. So it probably won't be this year, I guess. And Brian, you may know, probably have a better idea of that if you're still listening to us, but
I am, but I would need to check with some of my colleagues with regards to the CPHD work plan. I'm not 100% up on their scheduling for that.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
typically June or something, is when they do.
The work plan
Yeah,
is
So-
right around the budget.
so it's getting ready for the fiscal year. Okay, so if we're gonna try to do something. But as you said, it's probably a multi-year process.
Piece-wise.
Yeah,
I think it would be a multi-year process. I mean, maybe the sort of the template for how to do the analysis exists, but getting somebody freed up
right.
to really do the work.
But I think what we're hearing you underline is that it's never really been attacked from this environmental perspective.
No, it's not.
And we've got, I mean, not just people in the room, I just think Arlington in general has got a lot of energy around that it's right, this is the right time, I think, to put full force into it. In
Well, and
this
it's as
time
we were
frame.
talking about earlier, it's that since we can't require the tree planting other than the minimums that we know people could cut down the next day, but if you don't have the space, there's no way you're ever gonna get these. So we at least have to start with creating the space and then trying to build on.
Yeah.
And
opportunities.
yeah, my perspective is coming at it, like, I can't do it, so I rely on my neighbors. When I look at their giant lots and I'm envious of the amount of property they have to plant those trees, there are literally hundreds of thousands of people like me who would advocate for that position.
Right, yeah, it's because we do borrow the tree count in
Yeah,
a lot of ways.
we do.
For our clean air and clean water and
Yeah.
everything else that we're trying to.
We have to
get,
activate that.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, well, I feel like we should let you go, but do other people have questions? David, did you want to, I know you're not feeling well, but did you have any questions you want to ask Susan while we're here?
I'll try to, I guess it's a comment or an observation, but on page 29 of the board report from November 15th of 2005 that you sent out,
Yes, I did read it.
that's the page with the definitions. And we've been talking about square footage, but I think it's also intriguing to think about whether there might be ways now, more than 15 years later, to look at what's being built and look at the way our lots are used and think about whether there's anything about the definitions that go into this that might be leveraged as well. And I particularly think of it in terms of missing middle density, but that I believe that you had said that lot coverage in general, the state kind of has left alone for the local jurisdiction to handle in whatever way seems best. And so controlling the definition of what is counted and how it's counted and how it's included seems like it could have some potential. Driveways, patios, this and that kind of thing. I know that they're in there. But I think the two, sorry, I'm not full speed. The two definitions that I thought might be worth looking at are the definition of lot coverage itself, and then the which is partly a formula, and then the main building footprint, which is a content concept.
Yeah, things, the state code, it isn't that they just ignored coverage or didn't speak about coverage. They just give you permission to have a zoning ordinance or requirement. They don't get into dictating what the specifics of it. So it isn't just silent on coverage, it's silent on building heights and everything else around development specifics. In the lot coverage definition, that 150 square feet, which is an exempted structure. The reason it's exempted is because the building code doesn't require a permit. And we would never know about a structure being built until it shows up in a flyover or a Google Earth or something like that.
So shed, the
So,
play
I mean, 'cause
structure.
part of the thing that has to be done when you're crafting this kind of language is it has to be enforceable. And so, you know, if the building code was to be changed to say that a structure of 250 square feet was exempted, they might actually feel the need to amend this. So I didn't look on the county website, but I'm pretty sure the things that are included in the coverage calculation are in the determination. This paper doesn't actually, well, it does have some of them listed. Main building, accessories, driving and parking, patios higher than 8 inches, decks 4 feet or higher, gazebos or pergolas, stoops and landings 4 feet or higher above finished grade, and in-ground pools. So that's basically the determination. But any walkway that's paved to get you from your car to your house is not counted.
So interesting. You just
It's
put
not-
walkways everywhere.
It's not impervious surface.
Right.
When we know it is. Really,
Right.
for stormwater
Right.
purposes, it clearly is. So something that is being considered sort of as part of this effort, but also some of the stormwater issues, is being able to count some of those.
Well, and then a closer alignment between the impervious and coverage could certainly be a recommendation. That was discussed briefly when we were doing this, but again, people were like, we don't know where the walkways
And
are.
that's-
How are we gonna know?
But that's
It
a
wasn't
key
stormwater
improvement.
issue.
Right.
It wasn't
Yeah.
as big. a
Right,
deal.
and that's the way to connect this issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a logical one, you know, because you do get runoff. And people do have all sorts of paving materials and they've evolved quite a bit.
Well, what they found too, I know in talking to some of our DES folks, is that you get whatever your permit is, you do your building, and then you go and end up this big old patio that is, you know, in this much concrete, and that doesn't count.
Right.
And yet, it's clearly impervious surface.
Right.
Clearly contributing
Right.
to stormwater runoff. So, yeah, again, but how do you enforce that
Right.
kind of thing?
Well, the other thing is houses are not required to have gutters. If
Right.
you have gutters, they have to be, you know, up properly. So runoff just sheets.
Right.
And
I've seen that also in the beautiful historic homes.
So I want to just clarify a couple questions, but one that we talked a little bit about too was the garages and the porches, the patios, because that was supposed to be encouraged. And I know under the lot coverage on Missing Middle, that one of the proposals was to add that to the total that you could have. And the perspective we had from Forestry and Natural Resource Commission was it's really damaging to trees, especially in the back too. So was there any discussion about how to limit the amount of like bonus density? Are those the only two things?
those are the only two things that were brought up and the only two things that the board was, you know, willing to entertain at the time. It kind of came from the side. It wasn't a staff recommendation initially. It came from a planning commissioner, I think, or someone who I think was on the commission at
Or
that time.
HLRB.
Or HLRB, yeah. And, you know, promoting a particular form of development, if you will.
Which you get. I mean, visually, I understand where it's coming
Right.
from, but it has those other implications that you and I discussed too, that you
Right.
make these policy changes, you're not sure where it's gonna
Right.
lead, and it ends up
Snowballing.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I mean, this chart is just very difficult.
It's a good first
You
start.
go like that, you really have to study it to know how it would affect your own property.
So I do have another question too, because I know, and Ryan, this is something I will need to focus on too, because Susan and I talked a little bit about this, just the language in the FNRP draft on this topic and focused on the 56% as opposed to the fact that it's a sliding scale
Right.
and the lot coverage changes as well too.
Yeah, it kind of mixes and matches the two things. There was also some language about site plans and by right development that I think is a little bit off. I'll go back and look at it.
Love to have your comments.
Yeah.
And I'll
Yeah.
just send them to you.
Okay, yeah, that would be great, just to make sure that we're getting that. more
Yeah, it was just
precisely.
a process thing as much as
Uh-huh.
anything.
But I think it helps people don't get caught up on the 56% and instead are
Right.
challenged to improve what we've got already.
Well, you know, when they got rid of the 56%, everybody, because nobody was getting that
Yeah.
far, it was really hard.
That's important information.
And,
Yeah.
But now they probably, I know they are.
Yeah, I don't care
You know,
now,
my
though.
neighbors are getting into the square
Well,
inch.
there's
of
a
their
lot of stuff that
56%.
happens, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
you can pave your backyard with pavers and have a similar impact.
Why would you do that?
And the county will never know.
Don't put grass either then.
Yeah.
You know, they will never know.
Yeah.
And it's just, you know, they can't, you have to have cause to go on private property. You can't just wander around with your stuff. So,
I think GIS technology these days is
Helps a lot.
circumventing a lot of, I think that's the whole point. The
And the
whole thing behind the
Patriot Act, other
stormwater
things.
fee
Right.
is it'll be like GIS, AI, using
well, it was,
satellite
even in
images.
2005, it was extraordinarily
Yeah.
helpful to be able to look at what had actually happened and what difference it made. But, you know, some of those things don't, the county sometimes doesn't do the flyover timely, and
Yeah.
GIS is very useful, but even at that, you're still gonna miss things.
I have one more question that's on a different topic, and I don't know if you're the right person to ask, but I ask all these questions of you, so I'm gonna go ahead and try it, and you tell me where else we should go. Another issue that we had talked about over the years was the weed ordinance, and the fact that, you know, trying to do a native plant garden, and your neighbors can call and it's higher than 6 inches, then you're violating the weed ordinance. So, and I know an ordinance review, you all probably dealt with some of those as well, right?
Care of premise is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Code enforcement enforces that.
And it's
And
complaint driven, I understand,
It-
almost exclusively.
apparently it is these days. I think there's a definition of weed in the Code of Virginia.
There is. Well, it's by jurisdiction, because we did this through the Northern Virginia
Okay.
Regional Commission. Every jurisdiction had a different definition of weed.
Oh.
So we
okay.
proposed a new definition of a weed, which was actually a weed as opposed to a native plant. And, but it's just the process of getting that,
Well,
you know,
that's,
what's the process in Arlington?
it's a county code,
Mhm.
so that means the county manager is the technically enforcing authority, and then manager delegates to an agency.
Mhm.
So if you wanted to amend that provision, you would have to work with the people who have had that authority delegated to them.
Mhm.
So it would be Shariar's people, code enforcement, and to sort of create a carve out for, I don't know whether it be native plants or other kinds of, you know, because there's gardens all over the county that maybe some people don't like, but they're native plants,
And higher than 6 inches.
and
Yeah.
certainly higher than 6 inches. So,
Okay, so that is the process.
yeah, but
then,
it's a fairly short thing to
Mhm.
get it amended, in the sense that there's not a whole series of commissions
Because it's the delegated authority.
from the manager.
Okay.
Nice.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, you know, if code enforcement who is the day-to-day enforcer is lukewarm to that, or, you know.
Very lukewarm.
And you can't convince their boss that
Right.
it needs to be looked at, then probably a visit to the liaison for that department, in the
Mhm.
manager's office, probably where I would say you should go, or
Okay.
talk to Claude.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. This is so helpful. You're just,
Subvert authority.
That is
It's
right.
really good news with the county manager.
yeah,
It's achievable.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Call the
Gentlemen.
governor.
No. Ugh. Well, that wretched man.
So any other questions for Susan, David, or Jill? Do you have any other questions while we have her here?
No,
Not-
I'm so appreciative. Thank you so much. This was great, Carolyn and Susan. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, just having your historical reference and kind of putting all this in perspective for us, I think is just super helpful. So I'm
Okay.
very grateful
Well,
for
good,
taking the time to do it.
glad to do it.
And
Glad
as
to
you
do
know,
it.
I may have other questions for
That's
you.
all right. You know where to find me.
Yes, I do.
Have a good evening,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
so much.
You're welcome to stay for the rest of it, but you don't have to.
You don't need
So-
to.
Yeah. You've had your share of public meetings.
Done a lot of
That's
it. Thank you.
This is Piker stuff, right?
No, not at all. Just-
Okay, we want to go, and I had sent out the dates for the meetings, NRJAG meetings for the rest of the year, and I didn't hear any feedback, so I guess we're okay, but we want to officially approve those.
Yeah.
We're
A
good.
motion, whatever you need.
Although, we don't take votes.
Yeah, you're right.
So,
the other thing, and which we do not need to decide now, is that we can do
Good.
them all in person. However,
All
we
right.
can
have to
do
start
them
somewhere,
virtually
right?
as long as no more than 2 are in a row.
Right.
So just to keep that in mind.
Yeah, my
we-
thought is right now, let's just keep them
All
all
in?
in person, and
Okay.
then if something happens that we need to do it virtually, then we can,
I think that is a wise choice.
yeah, we can adjust.
Can
it.
I please flag that I will not be at the next meeting? I'm good with the
Okay.
rest of the calendar and I did make sure that that will work, but I'm not in town for that one.
Okay,
So it'll be
thank
February.
you. Did you
Okay,
want
so-
to call in, or no, you're out of?
I'm in India, different time
Oh,
zone with my family.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, we're gonna
Yeah,
wanna
yeah,
hear
yeah.
all about that then.
I'll be sleeping.
Okay, well, I will, we'll go ahead and send that out again to everybody, just so you have it, but just, wanted to make sure that that was, because some of the dates are not not always the first Monday, even though that's typically what we try to do.
And
Could
then,
we request possibly meeting holds, like, doesn't have to have the link at this point,
Oh, good
but
point.
just like calendar meeting holds?
so what we're gonna do is if this is fine with everyone, then we'll get this on a commission's calendar so that it's reserved there. So if other people want to know what's going on, then there you go. They can go see that on this day.
But, and you're also asking for actually send out one of those meeting holds for everybody.
Oh, no, I can't. So, I see what you're saying. I'm sorry.
So we
So
get
what
it
I
on our
can do
calendar.
is I can send a repeating,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
and send it out to everybody. But I couldn't do that until I actually
Yeah,
do this.
yeah.
So
Right.
that is definitely what I will do.
Awesome.
Okay, great.
Cool.
Excellent.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Makes my job a lot easier. So,
Okay, then I guess we'll go ahead and do staff updates.
okay. So as far as staff updates, one of the big ones I think that I should mention is that we are now reaching the completion of the deer assessment brow survey. And I see Phil looking through it. So here is they're wrapping up by the end of the month. We are then going to go into the engagement portion of this, which will probably take place after February 20th or so forward. There'll be some public meetings and so forth. Then there'll be some questionnaires and so forth that'll go out. All of this will be spelled out on the newly updated DEER page about all of this, including an updated timeline. However, just so you know, by the end of this month, there'll be a draft of some of the initial findings of the brow survey. Then we will be getting into then some of the commission meetings. And that's where I wanted to mention one other thing. So right now, it's in my calendar to come and give updates, not the contractor who's only on the hook for giving 3 public meetings, okay? But up to me to update all those which need to be updated, including commissions and so forth. Now, having said that, that is a lot of commission meetings. So I don't know, and nobody needs to decide that right away, but do I need to go to every commission in order to make these updates? Or is it good enough knowing that since we do have representatives in NRJAG of them, then so forth?
So I
Some are
guess it's
accepted.
mostly for, specifically PRC and NC2, because it definitely go to.
But so
Yeah, I
that
was
was
gonna
the
say,
point I was
we were
gonna.
gonna ask you to be
Yeah,
present
so,
if we don't
yes,
have the.
exactly. Now,
contractor
that was
ourselves.
the one thing, is that one is kind of done. That's what we're going to do. However, the other ones are kind of a little up in the air as whether or not we need to do this. We don't need to decide that now, but just so you
just
know.
whatever you're.
What is the timing right now? I'd
Okay,
love to
so-
bring it to, maybe we could bring it back to Marco, Jill, and discuss it, just be like, okay, do we have time for it is all the other aspect
Well,
here.
Okay,
Yeah, PRC tends to get jammed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so yes, so I did talk to Marco, and at this point, because we weren't sure and because we wanted to get on the calendar,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, yeah.
So
yeah,
I did ask Marco to at least ask about putting that, for us to do it for the Parks Commission or whatever, just because we needed to get that sooner. And that would be the very first one that I'm slated to kind of
Which
go
month,
do.
February?
Yes.
So
Okay.
Saturday?
we're doing our joint sports commission meeting in February, so we can't hear any
And
non-joint
that's
topics.
what Marco, I believe, had mentioned to me. So, okay, that's good to know now that I heard it in person. So anyway, so we do, again, I would like to kind of get this kind of look at it for the people that decide from different commissions.
Well, we can
However,
have
we're
some
definitely
FNRC
doing
too.
FNRC for sure. And
You're gonna do FNRC in February, I'm guessing then too.
yeah.
And then,
Assuming, I mean, this is if everything goes the right way and all of this goes through, which frankly, if you guys have
Sorry,
noticed,
we're laughing.
No,
I know,
Dear
and that's why I
is-
mention it, because some things are out of, completely out of my hands. But that is the
That's fine.
planned thing that we hope to
We
do.
plan for that in February,
And make
the
it.
fourth Thursday in February.
so then I would say, to be deliberative, if we're looking to target, commission meetings in February, that it would be more than fine for Parks and Rec to hear that at the NRJAG meeting itself.
Okay.
And to forego a individual parks presentation. If plans don't go to fruition, then perhaps we can look at engaging the March agenda for this.
And that is fine. And then again, like I said, the contractor's on the hook for 3 meetings and so forth, of which with the public meetings would be the one we really want him at. So, and perhaps FNRC. The other ones would just be me giving an update on what we have of the browser. It's just an initial report that this is what we have, this is what the conclusions were reached and so forth and so on. Okay, so anyway, just wanted to mention that. So that's one thing.
And sorry, just if we choose to do the February route, as soon as you get those dates, if you could let me know,
Yeah.
then at minimum, we can say at our February joint meeting, if you'd like more information, attend the NRJAG meeting later this month, because
Yeah, because we may
it
not
comes
get it.
after.
I mean, we may, it'll probably be March.
Okay,
It'll probably
so
FNRC first.
the problem is
Well,
also, of course,
probably.
so NRJAG's the beginning of the month,
Oh, yeah.
FNRC is the end of the month. And
Yeah.
so if it comes out too late that it can't be one or the other, then obviously,
So just keep us posted.
I know.
Yeah.
But we are reaching somewhere, phase 2 of the engagement, which will be very, very interesting. And we're looking at the questionnaire will probably close around April, the beginning of April, and then there'll be much more formal recommendations and so forth. But the engagement portion is beginning. So that's kind of a big thing. I think that I know people are very interested in learning more about.
This is
So
If you
good.
want any feedback on the questions and the questionnaire, let us know, informal.
Right.
Just because sometimes those, and you come out and you go, why did they ask it that way? Sorry, just if you want some feedback.
Yep. And again, I'll mention that to the contractor, White Buffalo, and see what, because right now they are looking at getting permissions to recycle some similar surveys that were done in other jurisdictions, because they said, okay, it was okay for them, therefore, they'll send it to its ask, but it probably will be the similar types of things that they want to relay for Arlington as well. Okay, so as I think I told you, we are fully staffed, and because we're fully staffed now with 3 people for Natural Resource Management Unit, that means that we are now freed up to do a lot of really cool things we want to do. And I'm really psyched about that. So this next year, I suspect that despite the FNRP, despite the trails, deer thing, we still will be able to get some really cool things being
You don't
accomplished.
think those 3 things are cool?
Oh, no, I think they're very cool, but that was like the minimum thing that we had to do. I can actually I don't have the excuse of we are understaffed, we can't do that, understaffed, can't do that, which has been my cry now for almost 2 years, or at least over a year. So can't go that way. So as long as we're fully staffed, we want to do this. And already I'm seeing some great new things. We've already wrapped up all of our public events for the native plant nursery way before we ever had to do it. And part of it is, frankly, Sue Kim, who's with us, is worked in a nursery trade, is much more efficient than I ever was. And it's great. So the only things left are individual trays and so forth. And we're using that time now to upgrade and renovate a lot of what the native plant nursery is going to look at. So when we start again in the springtime, I think people will be very, very pleased of how the improvements that we'll be making throughout the native plant nursery. So that's all good. And that also means that we can work on some things that we're sitting in the back burner. One of which is, some people may know that at one point, Arlington, despite its small size, did have 28% of all the native plants in Virginia, which is amazing how tiny we are, that more than a quarter of all the native plants in Virginia were found in Arlington. However, due to destruction and the habitat being dwindled and some habitats completely disappearing, we have over 200 plants which are extirpated, meaning they no longer exist locally in Virginia. They exist in other parts of Virginia, but not in Arlington. We're putting together a list of which things its valuable habitat will come into that we can return some of these extirpated species. And because of that, the wildlife which is associated with it will also come back, we assume, which is what's been happening with us just controlling invasives over the last few years. So that's a really cool thing that I think we can do is we come up with a plan, we're looking at those plants, we're looking at which ones to collect, and we're gonna, which habitats we can do and do that. We're also looking at single colonies of where if something happens in a park, through no fault of anybody, some disaster like what happened in Barcroft, where the lone colony of false hellebore, something happened, it's gone, whatever. We're gonna now try to increase those single colonies into multiple colonies where the habitat exists so that we're not, you know, so that one little thing does not wipe out the only existing colony within Arlington. We're also looking at our voucher specimens and what things we have to make sure that the state knows that we still have some of these things and which ones are not. So there's lots of little things now that we are working on that we have staff to be able to do these kinds of things. So I'm really psyched about how that's going through, and I think that's gonna really be something to look forward to over the next year, 2 or 3 years, because for trees especially, it's going to be a while before we can do this. We're looking at things we have meant to do it, like the idea of fostering out some plants, because we can't afford to grow trees for 2 or 3 years because it takes up way too much of our planting beds. Therefore, with the tree stewards and so forth, have them farm it out. They can take care of a few plants for us, and when they're done, we're going to turn them to us, and then it won't tie up all of our nursery space. An original idea that Greg Zell had mentioned that we can finally start working on. We also, and I've already started doing it, started to update the natural research, the wildlife technical report, because the other one was horribly out of date. New things have popped in that we know, the new things have moved in because we started doing it. So I started a first crack at it, and I'm hoping that by the time, knock on wood, that the FNRP is done, I can release the wildlife technical report as well. That is my hopes, and now I can actually get to do that. So again, I'm really looking forward to this year, because now that we're fully staffed and such excellent staff with both Jen and Sue, that I really think we can get a lot of these things just the beginning. That's just what we're working on now, but get it out of the way for the new thing. So that's wraps up, I think, my staff report. Just I'm really hopeful this next year and the following years will be fantastic. And these are the first few things that we'll be starting to work at. The very first taxon inventory we're going to do are going to be plants again. Why? Because we want to see what things are disappearing, and because everything else kind of depends on plants. And so we're going to, you know, that'll be the next inventory that we're going to do on a rolling basis, which is what's called for FNRP. Okay, so there you go. That's
Great.
my staff.
That's
report.
encouraging. So good news.
2023 is the year of the native plant.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
There you
that's
go.
good. Okay, we can go through commission reports real quick.
Sure, I
Do you
can
wanna
start.
do? Okay.
Parks and Recreation is, we should be working on our end of year plan and plan of action for the upcoming year. Those are both on my plate, haven't been started, guys, so that's coming down the pike. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we are having a joint meeting with the Sports Commission in February. Topics that we're hoping to cover are some kind of things. We actually haven't had a joint meeting with the Sports Commission since I think it was pre-COVID, 2018 or 2019.
Yeah.
And so we're covering, our major topics is a financial overview. Jane is planning on coming, so if you're interested in that. We're going to be covering a myriad of topics that we talked about today, including potential ball recycling programs. There's a question about field allocation, especially on the soccer side, we want to get into a little bit. A conversation about the new summer camp registration process. I've heard a lot of comments about that. We'd like to talk about that. And really there, just the cliff notes there is that we'd like to tell staff we want to be involved in changing processes, because we've heard so much about it, basically, and we're not.
What date is that meeting?
We're finalizing the location right now, but the date is, it's off our regular. It's the final Thursday.
It's the 23rd of it?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Joe.
It'll be ours,
Yeah, it's your day too. Yeah, okay, let me know if you want any representation though, let me know. And then I don't think that there's any other major topic. We're gonna talk a little bit about pickleball. as well. Just, you know,
Just
the
a little.
recreation, the Parks and
Every
Recreation
park
side of
and
it.
rec
Yeah.
across the United States is talking about pickleball. So
Right.
you better talk about it.
So
He's not
Sports
talking
Commission's
about
written
it.
a beautiful report. They're gonna give us basically a little overview on it. So those are the main topics of synergy we really wanted to focus on. And then we'll move forward with our March plans as normal. So that's kind of an overview of what we're doing right now.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, Forestry Natural Resources Commission, we really had two primary areas of focus at our last meeting. One was on the stormwater utility program. We were introduced to that. And the concept that it's not designed to incentivize, at least that was our takeaway from it. It's also not designed to raise revenue. It's only to offset revenue. And so we were actually rather disappointed in this program and felt that they were missing opportunities to advance some important issues, among other things, retaining large trees, already existing large trees. There's no incentive to keep a large tree, for instance, under this proposed program. Rather, you get credit for planting 2 little small whips in your yard and taking down the 60-year oak tree or something. So anyhow, we sent a letter. We will be sending a letter on that, expressing the view that the county should take advantage of this opportunity and increase incentives for things that are meaningful for stormwater, particularly like larger trees or more trees. The other thing we talked about, we had a presentation from Paul Gilbert, Executive Director of Nova Parks. We'd asked him to talk to us about his stewardship of the natural lands under his park's control. And he told us that in the new strategic plan, they've developed a major focus on invasive removal and restoration of wildlife habitat. There's money in the budget for that. We don't know how much, but he said that there is money in the budget. He said that Potomac Overlook Regional Park, one of the jewels parklands in Arlington County, is on that list to be a priority to be worked on. Don't know exactly when, but his news was essentially good news that Nova Parks is actually committing to focus on natural habitat protection and restoration. And so we're looking forward to working, to seeing how that develops and encouraging the working together on this program for Nova Parks with Arlington County Parks. They have a good history of that. And I'm sure that they'll be looking for your help, Alonzo, and your team to provide some assistance or guidance on what they would do in the Arlington Parks. We also finalized our 2022 year-end report and the action plan for this present year. And so I need to send you a copy of that.
I'd love that. Thank you.
I realized I did not send that out. And I guess that's all that we talked about at our meeting. Other than wished everyone, happy holidays. That kind of good
That
stuff.
counts.
Okay, great. I did not get a report from Joan. She's at one of the SPRC meetings tonight
Got
on
it.
Crystal Towers or whichever
Yeah,
one it
yeah,
was. So
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't make it. Sean was out of the country and I don't know what happened to Kayla, but we'll hopefully get her next time. So I just wanted to, David, while you're still on, and Jill, you might, did you?
Jill has her hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to share a little bit of good news about the Tree Canopy Equity Program. We did the tally today. It's the preliminary tally of the equity neighborhoods for which we got the Virginia Forestry Grant, and we met our goal within 1 shrub.
Oh, great.
So we got 120 trees and 100 shrubs among the 10 equity neighborhoods. And so if you know somebody who's still looking for a shrub, we'll take their application.
That's
This is
amazing.
preliminary. It's not yet been viewed by the committee and so forth, but we're very, very, very pleased.
Oh, that's
So
fantastic.
thanks for all the wonderful support for that.
Such an
Thanks
effort.
for your work on that. That's fantastic.
Do you have, do you have those numbers handy? It'd just be interesting to know how many trees, how many shrubs.
Oh, I do. I was answering an email from Mary Glass. We have 29 small trees, which are either French tree or sweet bay magnolia. We have 79 shrubs, and we have 71 big trees, which are the same as the canopy trees under the Tree Canopy Fund.
That's excellent.
And that's on top of whatever might have come in through the normal process. So that's just the equity piece.
Oh, that's just what you recruited.
Right. I think there's probably 100 applications for the big trees, but don't quote me on that. But somewhere in that neighborhood. So, yeah, we're accumulating the volunteer hours because it was a huge effort.
Of course.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for letting me talk about that.
No, that's great. Thank you
Thanks
for
for sharing.
reporting that. I just wondered, well, David and Jill are both on here and Trudy too, and Phil, one of the SPRCs that we had done, and David, I think will remember this, that I think was the Food Line, it was Columbia Pike and George Mason. And they had done this great native plant garden, biophilic garden. Apparently they ripped it all out, put in an irrigation system. And I haven't seen it yet, but I just heard from some
For
neighbors.
shame.
So anyway, I just flagged that when we're doing these SPRCs, we may need some condition language, because if, I mean, that was great. It was a fabulous plan. Olin did the design. It was, everyone was thrilled about it. And then to see the whole thing being pulled out was heartbreaking.
If I could add just a tangent, I've been trying to get, and this is back in the day when they were planting all sorts of pioneer habitats and things like that, trying to get it so that when they put in some kind of something having to do with water retention or something like that, if we could just go the extra step and make them pollinator way stations. However, there was some big resistance from DES about doing it, because they did not want us to put in all of these plants and do that, and then a few years later them having to tear it down because they need to do something with that site, and in which case they get a black eye because they tore apart this monarch way station. So I don't know how that fits in with all of this, but just to keep that in mind, that when
Yeah,
you're
but
starting,
those were road projects.
yeah, that was
This
just
was not, this was a park. I mean, this was part, supposed to be a public space that was supposed to highlight native plants. So it wasn't a stormwater retention. It wasn't any of that. It was supposed
It's
to be.
giving me, it's making me think that projects that are analogous to it, like the redesign of the Harris Teeter on Glebe,
Yeah,
near Buckingham.
right.
They're planning on doing that whole middle section where you want to have that biophilic, there's a word for it where you can grab the food and go, like apple trees and
Urban ag.
yeah, urban agriculture way. I could see them doing the same thing, something like
Because
that.
it definitely requires more sophisticated management than just the mow and blow folks.
Totally.
That, everything looks the same.
And the food line project was the same.
Yeah. So anyway, I just have to, one step forward, two steps backwards kind of thing, I think is what we're doing. But anyway, so that may be something as we're looking at SPRCs to specifically include condition language to make sure that these things are maintained in perpetuity and not just after 2 years.
So Carolyn, there's no enforcement? There's no enforcement that
No,
Don't
unless
make them
it's
put it back?
plan condition language, you're not going to get any enforcement.
Yeah, but I will say, I guess, in the Joyce Motors SPRC, there was conversation. They don't have like any type of public space, but on the streetscape, because they don't have like space for anything more than just street trees, really, they're like, oh, we're gonna do vertical plantings on one of the building faces, like leading into the Clarendon area. And in the meeting, there was a lot of discussion about like maintenance of that
Yeah,
type of
because we
infrastructure.
get like a Costco.
Because people say that all the
Poster
time,
child.
and they never maintain the plans, and it's just this like ugly trellis with nothing growing on it, right? And I forget exactly what Commissioner Hughes said, but I do think like SPRC, like maintenance is off limits. There was some like pushback from staff in the room and the PC chair of like, we can talk about this in like soft ways, but like there's no like hard requirement we can put on like maintenance of this infrastructure. So
Okay, so we should look into that.
yeah,
Let's push the
I think we
line.
should look at
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Because
I
I
mean, it
know
makes
that
sense.
biz can do it. They can do a lot of sort of moral suasion with like if they take down a tree or they're not taking, if they don't replace a tree, and
Bids have soft capital in a way that like PC doesn't, right? And I think that's the difference. It's like,
okay,
yeah,
that's
it's from like the like planning. I'm in urban planning master's program, so we talk a lot about this stuff of like how you use actual mechanisms, right? But that's just my perspective on it, at least. space. Right?
Okay,
So
no, I
that's fine.
appreciate hearing that.
Yeah.
And, you know, what tools do
Because
we
like bid
have?
is like
Not
a,
many.
you get, if you're a local business, you get something back from a bid, you know, like you buy in, but then you get benefits.
Right.
That's not the case in that SPRC process,
No,
right?
right.
Like, it's a very
We're
different,
advocating
and
for
it's
the
legally
trees.
binding,
Yeah.
and like county boards involved, so there's a lot of hard requirements that.
Yeah,
like,
if you've
PZ
got
has to
any
be
more,
following.
if you had come right across any other details, if you could share that with us.
Yeah,
That
I'd
would be
like to,
great.
I'm sure I could just go back to the recording of that PC meeting, because there was like a lot of discussion in that SPRC meeting about maintenance of the vertical plantings and like
Okay.
what that would look like, so.
Okay, because I know that the Costco building is a perfect example that they supposedly had these planters. They just, after maybe a month, they looked horrid.
Yeah.
There was no maintenance and they're just for these concrete things hanging there and it's really unattractive. So,
Yeah.
okay, well, thank you. Is there, let's see, what else? Do we have anything else? Any new business anybody has to bring up? Guess not?
No.
Okay. Thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it. David, I know you're not feeling well. Jill, thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it. Brian, thank you as well. And good to see you all. We look forward to a productive new year. Brian, do you have any updates? I'm sorry to completely forgot to ask. Do you want to update us?
Oh, sure. I can provide a short
If you
one.
said
The main
The least you can do, right?
the main one, at least in like a concrete way, is that the engagement summary and engagement report for the most recent round of public engagement on the FNRP has been published to the website, and I believe our e-blast kind of notifying folks of that should go out tomorrow morning, if not by Wednesday morning. So, you know, if for anybody who wants to dig deeper into what Adam and I presented the last time I came, those documents are all up on the website. Beyond that, we are, you know, diligently making edits in response to all the comments that are represented in that report, going back and forth with the contractors and working to get the text resolved so we can start formatting the kind of glossier, graphically or graphics heavy version of the final draft. So still kind of on track for that, you know, first third of 2023 to bring that forward to the public. But beyond that, the timeline gets a little bit hazy because we still have a lot of like moving of pixels to do, I think, to get us there. But probably be able to give a more detailed timeline update next month once we get like the next round of edits back from American Forests.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being with us as
Mhm.
well.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, well, good to see you all. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in February then. Bye.
Have a good night, y'all.
The other thing for you too, is we're gonna enter a season where I need to recruit for Parks and Recreation. So if there's anybody that you want to pass over, Phil?
That needs to move on.
Yeah, I have
May
no one
not
to pass
want to.
I
back.
have somebody who I might try to